Hello and welcome back. Today we are diving into ecological cycles, or really we're going to look a little bit deeper into the cycling of elements through living and non-living organisms. I'm going to warn you right now, buckle up. This one's a long one. There's a lot of information in here, so let's go ahead and get started. So let's start off with the definition, right? What is this geological cycle? So this is just the process in which a molecule moves through living and non-living storages on Earth. The three examples that we're going to look at for these cycles is the water cycle, the carbon cycle, and the nitrogen cycle. You've probably heard of the water cycle before, so we're going to start there. So another word for the water cycle is the hydrologic cycle. I know, it's a big word, but hydro, you've probably heard that in reference to water before, so if you ever see that word, just know that it means the water cycle. So the water cycle itself is driven by the sun, right? The sun has the ability to transform matter, right? As it heats up water, or as water heats up in general, it will evaporate. Well, the sun produces heat, and that heat can heat up water, so it can transform water. The water cycle itself is divided into abiotic and biotic parts, right? Living and non-living. And so let's dive into some of the key words that you would find in the water cycle. When water vapor or water from like a river or a lake or the ocean gets heated up, it will evaporate into the sky, right? So evaporates up into the atmosphere, and as that water vapor from the atmosphere starts to condense, it will kind of condense into clouds. It will then go through precipitation in the form of rain or snow, and it will come back down to the ground. Now, when it hits the ground, some water will seep into the ground. That's called infiltration, right? The water will infiltrate the ground, like, you know, some people like infiltrate behind enemy borders, right? So it will go into the ground, but sometimes that ground will become saturated, right? It will take in as much water as it can, but it cannot take any more, and it becomes saturated at that point. And so once the ground is saturated, some of the water will then run off into the river, lake, stream, whatever it is that's closest to it, but that's called runoff. It will fall off of the ground and go into the area of water that we're closest to, and then again that cycle will continue. Now that this water is in like the surface area, the surface water area, it will heat up again and it will evaporate, blah blah blah, go through the cycle again and again and again, because water is something that will continuously cycle through an ecosystem. If you thought that was the only things you needed to know about the water cycle, you were wrong. There is also another word, and it's called transpiration. And this one maybe you haven't heard of before. Transpiration happens in plants. When plants absorb water through their roots, right, they then proceed to push the water from their roots through the stem out into the leaves. And once they're in the leaves have openings, and through those openings the water will evaporate out. And when that water evaporates out of the leaves into the atmosphere, that's called transpiration. So transpiration is a new fancy word, but it is in the water cycle, but it really only involves plants. Humans don't do this. When we sweat, that's just sweating. We don't call that transpiration, even though the water is evaporating from our skin. It's not the same thing, and so transpiration is only in plants. Okay, that was our first cycle, probably the one that was most familiar to you. So let's move into maybe a little bit less known territory. Let's dive into the carbon cycle. We've talked about carbon quite a bit this year, so the idea of carbon and carbon dioxide is not brand new to you. But let's just review some of the basics. Plants can take carbon dioxide, CO2, from the air and then make glucose from that, right? And then that's called photosynthesis. And when they make that glucose, the plants make that glucose, they can then be eaten by other animals, and that carbon can be transferred to those animals. So the idea of photosynthesis and plants taking in the CO2 from like the air around them, that's part of the carbon cycle through photosynthesis. As organisms eat the plant and move the carbon from organism to organism, that's the movement of biomass and produces more biomass, right? As you continue to eat, you are gaining mass. And then all organisms, plants and animals, and anything with a mitochondria, perform respiration. And that is the release of CO2 as a waste product, okay? So you see this here, that CO2 in the atmosphere can go into plants, and then also over here we have animals and plants both respiring, which is releasing CO2 back into the atmosphere. We're going to talk about these other ones on the next few slides, but just so that we have this slide covered. So as we continue on, there's two kind of big ones that you should definitely know that are really specific to carbon, but also like just mega super important. Decomposition and the formation of fossil fuels. So decomposition is when living organisms die, their organic matter is broken down by decomposers like fungi, worms, bacteria, and then those decomposers release CO2. Then there's also the idea of the production of fossil fuels, which is just when things start to decompose with a lot of time, some heat, some pressure, you can form fossil fuels. So in this case, we have sort of this idea of death and decomposition here, right? CO2 is kind of being all released and transformed through decomposers, or they can just go deeper into the ground, and that will add the pressure as you go further into the ground, and heat and time, of course, and eventually it will turn into a fossil fuel like oil, which is something that we as humans use quite a bit of. And then last for the carbon cycle is this idea of combustion, which is the burning of stored carbon that's trapped in wood or other formerly living organisms, like fossil fuels, right? We burn fossil fuels like all the time. All the time. Factories are constantly burning fossil fuels. But CO2 can also be released when living organisms are burned. So like if there's a forest fire, that releases a lot of CO2 into the atmosphere at once when it wouldn't normally be released, right? Because those living organisms would use the CO2, not release it. But this idea of combustion, it happens a lot in urban areas like cities or where there's a lot of factories. Cars release like carbon, right, because they're using fuel, and that's going through combustion, so it's releasing this carbon into the atmosphere. All of these things are part of how carbon can be continuously cycled through ecosystems. And last but certainly not least, let's talk about the nitrogen cycle. Now, I don't know how familiar you are with the Earth's atmosphere, but the majority of Earth's atmosphere is actually made up of nitrogen, not oxygen. Oxygen is the second most common gas in our atmosphere, but by a long shot. Nitrogen makes up 78% of the atmosphere. But what's crazy is most living things can't actually use nitrogen gas. It's not a usable form of nitrogen that they can comfortably use in their bodies. So the idea of usable nitrogen is actually a limiting factor for humans and other organisms, but I'm a human, so I immediately think of a limiting factor for me. So the nitrogen cycle, its whole point, really, that we're going to focus on, is taking this nitrogen gas and turning it into usable nitrogen. Now, there are 5 major parts of the nitrogen cycle, and I would guess that you have not really been exposed to the nitrogen cycle much before, so these 5 aspects of the nitrogen cycle are going to be new, and there's going to be a lot of new words in here. We're going to practice in class, but I just want you to kind of see what's happening, and we're going to relate to the picture quite frequently. So The first two parts are nitrogen fixation and ammonification. Nitrogen fixation takes gas from the atmosphere and through living things turns it into usable nitrogen. This is typically done through mutualistic relationships between bacteria and legumes, which are like plants, like peanuts are a legume, beans. Nitrogen can also be fixed via lightning strikes, which is kind of interesting. So you see this here, right? We have our atmospheric nitrogen, and over here we have nitrogen-fixing bacteria. This is found in the roots of those legumes, and also lightning can fix that nitrogen as well. And as you fix that nitrogen, it does become usable for those plants. The second major part is ammonification. This is when bacteria or fungi convert unusable nitrogen gas from dead organisms, right? We see this here as animals die, the bacteria and fungi go through ammonification and produce ammonia and ammonium. Okay, so this is another way to get a usable form of nitrogen. Ammonia is a usable form of nitrogen. The third major part of the nitrogen cycle is nitrification. So this is when soil bacteria then take this ammonia that was formed and convert that into nitrites and nitrates. Just more types of nitrogen that can be used from living things. And you see that on the bottom here, right? Nitrification happens and you can create nitrites and nitrates right here, which then can be used by organisms if they need nitrogen. The fourth part is assimilation of usable nitrogen. So plants will absorb those nitrates or ammonium ions from the soil into their roots, and that's really how we get it, because we then eat the plants. So plants do all the heavy lifting of absorbing all of that usable nitrogen, and then we're just like, hey plants, what's up? I'm going to eat you and I'm going to get that nitrogen that I need. So in this sense, the animals are a little bit lazy, and the plants are doing a lot of the heavy lifting. And then fifth and final major part of the nitrogen cycle is denitrification. So this is taking those usable nitrates, and transforming them back into unusable nitrogen gas by bacteria in the soil. So this happens when there's low levels of oxygen, and so they will use this to bring it back into the atmosphere when needed. Now, the key for the nitrogen cycle that is not actually written anywhere, but hopefully you're listening to this, bacteria are doing almost all of this, right? Bacteria are going through nitrogen fixing, they're going through ammonification, like they're bringing the nitrogen and going through these processes, they're doing the nitrification. All of this is through bacteria. They are massively important in the nitrogen cycle, and then plants are able to then use all of that stuff that they're creating, all of those usable forms of nitrogen that bacteria are creating, and then animals just eat the plants to get that. So there is a little bit that humans can do to kind of be a part of this nitrogen cycle, but a lot of this is through bacteria and plants. All right, I know this was a bit of a doozy, but I'm super proud of you for sticking through, and we will practice a lot of this in class. I'll see you then.